2 years ago, the State Parliament legislated to fully protect Aboriginal heritage sites. From rock engravings and tree carvings to archaeological sites, New South Wales is rich with an often ignored pre-European history. Despite tough penalties, it appears thousands of artefacts are still being destroyed, from a combination of ignorance and a lack of enforcement by authorities. Sally Block with this report.
Australia's landscape is rich with the masterpieces of Indigenous artists. Carved, engraved or painted, they signpost more than meeting places. The art traces stories of celestial beings across the earth, moon and stars.
We see lots of petroglyphs or rock engravings of different types of figures. We see shields, we see fish, we see culture heroes like Mullen, we see engravings of emus, even penguins. So we have a lot of artifacts and a lot of different types of engravings around the area here.
For Dwayne Hammaker, it's science and not just history that makes this rock art site unique. High on a plateau in Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park, he's investigating ancient knowledge that's been traced in the stone.
We're trying to examine if there's any sort of astronomical symbolism with these rock engravings. Unfortunately, we don't know a lot about the meanings of the engravings.
The astrophysicist is part of a fraternity researching Aboriginal knowledge of astronomy.
When that point are coming down and looking down, and we say that, we say with the language, that means Ishamanafi plum.
So it's a lot like solving a puzzle. We have to look at different pieces of evidence. So one of the pieces of evidence is that some of the engravings, like the emu, seems to mimic the emu in the sky, which is traced out by the dust lanes in the Milky Way itself. This is a case where somebody's taken a rock like this. You can see it's been grooved on the sides, and they've tried to go in and re-groove it.
Today, Hammaker is worried. He says researchers are racing against time to document these sites because even deep inside highly protected national parks, there's fresh damage.
They may not have realised it, but they've actually damaged this engraving.
It's the same story across much of New South Wales, and many Indigenous people are anxious that more and more ancient heritage could be vanishing. 2 years ago, one of the state's most significant Aboriginal heritage sites was lost under the concrete foundations of this fast food franchise. The country's largest KFC restaurant was built here in Newcastle in spite of an archaeological survey finding thousands of years of history on the dig site. Some of the early artefacts predate the antiquities of Egypt.
Basically, it looks like we found a lahab. There's a lot of charcoal, so we pulled samples of that for dating.
Gianni De Gravio is the archivist at the University of Newcastle, a custodian of thousands of artefacts rescued from that dig.
It's an important site historically because it was the site of the government farm, and when the first missionary to the Aborigines at the time arrived, the Reverend Throckeld, they put him up there for the first year, and it was there that he began the first methodical study of an Aboriginal language ever. So it's really significant from that point of view.
Despite the promising finds, legally there was no obligation for developers to preserve them, either to protect their heritage or investigate further. The excavation and construction was fully approved by local and state governments prior to the architect's report being delivered, and that worries Gianni.
You know, one of the councillors on Council once said to me, look, you can't have Aboriginal sites everywhere, we've got businesses to run. And I said, all right, well, you take me to one Aboriginal site that I can show someone. And he goes, you got me there.
A spokesperson for KFC says they have fulfilled all legal requirements to do with construction, including continuing to work with local elders for appropriate on-site recognition of the buried heritage. But the Newcastle case is not unique, says Greens MLC David Shoebridge, and he adds the state government ultimately has to answer for its lax protections.
What we are seeing is instead of protecting the sites, at best we get conditions put in place that they have to photograph the site before they destroy it and maybe secure a small number of artefacts from the site.
We can't have people out at every site telling people, no, you can't develop or you can't dig here because there's a site. We just haven't got the manpower to do that.
Paul Morris from the Metropolitan Land Council agrees, saying groups like his are underfunded. Today he's visiting a listed site in Cromer on Sydney's northern beaches, where he alleges electricity subcontractors cut up an engraving of a sacred footprint while laying a cable.
Well, this is the outline of the heel.
After 2 years of pressure, a case is now before the Land and Environment Court. Oskridge, the respondent, is unable to comment for legal reasons. But for the local Indigenous people, the outcome in court won't undo the cultural damage.
One of the first comparisons we'll draw is, this is like a memorial site to us. This is evidence that of the first history of this country, the first Australian history, and to see that just destroyed. If you compare that to an Anzac memorial in a park, being destroyed, that's really disheartening.
The Greens say the government dragged its feet when it came to taking what he says is a weak action.
If these sites were in Rome or in Paris or in London, they would be given plaques, extraordinary levels of protection and national respect. But in Australia, we have sites that are 10 and 20,000 years old, being destroyed for things like fast food outlets. It's simply a crime.
There's no easy fix to protect the state's fragile sites like this one here in Bondi. While the Greens and land councils want more money spent on enforcement, an Environmental Ministry staffer has told 7:30 New South Wales that its officers are handling all legal and development issues appropriately. But is that enough to halt the spread of destruction?
The message is that we're saying is that, we like your culture, we'll do the acknowledgement and the welcome to countries, but when it comes down to the nitty-gritty of actually making sure that we look after and document and make sure that those stories are backed up with real evidence, and that's what you find when you do archaeological digs, is real evidence, then we're involved in a form of cultural genocide.
Paul Morris says the vanishing culture belongs to us all and must be saved at all costs.
The history of this country is built on Aboriginal history, so to see that history destroyed, it's really disheartening.
And the state government will convene a Heritage Working Party early next year. Tomorrow is World AIDS Day, and to mark that event, the Powerhouse Museum is hosting the Access to Life exhibition. The exhibition was created by the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria. It features 250 photographs of sufferers from some of the world's best photographers. The most recent images were taken in Papua New Guinea, which has a serious and rapidly growing problem with HIV and AIDS. Sharon O'Neill went along to the exhibition opening.
What this exhibition does, this Access to Life exhibition, is bring a human face to the global statistics. Just think that over the last 30 years, 60 million people have been infected by this disease. 30 million people have passed away because of this disease. As we speak today, 34 million people are living with the HIV infection.
The Global Fund was set up about 10 years ago by the G8 countries, the big industrialised countries of the West, to address a really serious problem that had emerged. In the early years of HIV, there was no treatment. It was about 10 months from infection to death. Then in the mid-90s, antiretroviral therapies started to become available, and they are the difference between life and death. So 10 years later, the Global Fund has about $30 billion to fight HIV, tuberculosis, which is associated with HIV, and malaria.
This exhibition existed for a number of years beforehand and has travelled very extensively, and I wasn't involved in this before. So the Global Fund came and asked me, if I would go to Papua New Guinea and to add a new section, as it were, specifically for the show here. I was surprised by how forthcoming people were. I didn't expect people to be given the prejudice and everything that does exist there and the discrimination, that they would be as open as they were to talking to us and being photographed and sharing their story.
The estimate's about 34,000 people living with HIV. The majority of transmission in PNG is from sexual contact, so unprotected sex. We don't really see any injecting drug use. Like if you went to Eastern Europe and parts of China, a lot of it's transmitted through people who are sharing needles. We don't really see that as an issue in PNG, so we've got mainly heterosexual transmission.
All the people that we met was essentially people who had started antiretroviral treatment. I mean, they vary between Norman, who's behind me now, as it were, who, because of all these sort of prejudices and the discrimination, had held back from sort of accepting the idea that he might have had AIDS, and he was in a pretty bad state, and he had started taking treatment finally, and he was beginning to see the benefits of it.
The treatment has to be taken every day, and that pill has to go into the mouth of a particular person to be prescribed or delivered by a clinic. The drugs have to be kept on a constant stream to come from the central distribution points in Port Moresby to the rural and regional areas and then to the clinic. So that's the challenge, but I think Papua New Guineans are doing a very great deal better than they were and really moving to try to get on top of it now.
In parts of the country, it's polygamous society, so a husband may have 2 or 3 wives. And so, yes, we do have incidents where the wife comes in, she's pregnant, we test her, she tests positive, then we get the husband in, we test him, and then there might be 3 other wives, and we find that they're also infected. Who's got it, where it's come from, we don't know. How it's got into that grouping, it is always difficult to say, and we don't like to get into a situation of trying to pinpoint that and blame.
I've got one little section that I wanted to put in very much, which was actually taken in a graveyard, and it was a community worker trying to show me where the unmarked grave of a friend of hers was, because the friend hadn't taken the drugs, she had died of HIV, she had been rejected by her family, she had been kicked out of her community, and the only people at a funeral were the sort of the workers who had become her friends. You know, her family didn't even come to the funeral. So at one end of the scale, that's it. You don't belong, you're nobody. But at the other end of the scale, you've got people who, you know, Norman, again, going back to Norman, you know, his brother's there helping him to try to learn to walk again. And they get that support. So it's not everybody who's kind of hit by the prejudice and the lack of understanding and so on. There's some very good stories in there too.
When I looked through and saw the photos of my people on the wall, it brought me joy, because it's kind of showing the work. I get involved with people who have HIV and AIDS, but it's coming out to a bigger picture. So I was happy to see this morning and tonight. I feel so happy that globally here in Australia and internationally know about what's happening in my country and our response towards HIV.